So good evening and welcome everyone. Thank you so much for joining us this evening. And if you have any questions at all during tonight's town hall for Carla or for our subject matter expert, George, feel free to comment in the Zoom chat or in the Zoom Q&A. Or if you're watching us on Facebook Live, feel free to comment on this post and I will get those queued up for the Q&A as well. Again, thanks for joining us. And Carla, I'll turn it over to you.
Okay, thank you, Kelsey. I didn't have a town hall last week because I went camping. And I found out that camping is one of the safest activities we can do during this pandemic, as long as you keep your distance from people that are not in your group. Tonight, our guest is George Gordon, who is a retired professor of political science and a veteran member of the McLean County Board. Thank you for joining us, George.
Thank you for inviting me, and it's a pleasure to be here.
Yeah. So I spend most of my days painting in people's homes, and I listen to podcasts all day long. And one of the things I learned about was how Republicans played a long game to gain control of state legislatures and then eventually more and more of Congress. Even though this is not the case in Illinois, George, I would like to hear a little history lesson from you, if you would, about how and why it is that so many other states are controlled by Republicans.
Well, Republicans control so many states right now because in the 2010 midterm elections, halfway through President Barack Obama's first term, the GOP nationwide picked up 6 governorships. And maybe more important, flipped control of 20 state legislative chambers. That's not 20 state legislatures, that's a total of 20 chambers, giving them a substantial advantage in the redistricting of both state and federal legislative districts that occurred after the 2010 census. And of course, we're looking to that same kind of pattern, the elections in 2020, followed by redistricting in 2021. Mm-hmm. In all but a handful of states, it's the state legislature or a commission of some sort created by the legislature that draws up new legislative districts. So the 2010 election is the key reason, looking back right now, that Republicans have had such good fortune, as they see it, in terms of being able to control the redistricting process, because they gained control of more states, more state legislatures than they had up to that point. I will point out that Republicans aren't the only ones who play this intensely partisan game. Mm-hmm. Where Democrats have been in control of the redistricting process in a particular state, they have benefited from the redistricting. And one good example of that is the state that we're sitting in, the state of Illinois. And we'll have more to say about that a bit further. There have been efforts to change things through the federal courts, mainly the federal courts. Mm-hmm. Just over a year ago, in late June of 2019, the U.S. Supreme Court ruled in a 5-4 decision that partisan redistricting is a political question, political in quotes, not reviewable by federal courts. The technical term for that is non-justiciable. A justiciable question is something that the courts can take up and decide, but a non-justiciable question is the opposite. And those courts can't judge it even if extreme gerrymandering violates the Constitution. The 2019 decision came after 2 cases reached the Supreme Court, and there was a little bit of bipartisanship here. One of those cases originated in North Carolina, where Republicans controlled the process. The other originated in Maryland, where the Democrats were in charge.
Right.
Then there's Wisconsin. And if you look at the screen share, looking at the very recent 2018 elections, Wisconsin wasn't directly involved in the 2019 Supreme Court ruling. Wisconsin elected a Republican governor and a GOP majority legislature in 2010. Subsequently, through a series of maneuvers, it enacted a state legislative map that many consider one of the most gerrymandered in the country. In 2012, Republicans claimed 5 of Wisconsin's 8 congressional seats, and that is in the U.S. House, despite winning less than half of the state's total votes cast for the U.S. House of Representatives. If you look at the 2018 map, The popular vote for the Wisconsin legislature, 53% to 40, about 45% Democrat, Republican, but the Republicans won 64% of the seats. That's at the state legislative level. And if you look at the Pennsylvania and Michigan results in 2018, you see very much the same sort of pattern, although not as egregious a disparity as exists in Wisconsin between the popular vote percentages and the shares of seats won. The Republican Party majority in Wisconsin has persisted overall for most of this decade. And again, we see the 2018 pie charts indicating just what I've said.
Right. That is just mind-boggling to me that the popular vote is, more for the Democrats, but then they elect the Republicans. That is some highly technical, careful map drawing there.
Mm-hmm. Oh, yes.
And you're right. So, okay. So just to reiterate, in 2012 and 2014, despite Democrats winning a majority of the statewide assembly vote, Republicans won 60 out of 99 assembly seats. So that's the state legislature.
Right.
Okay, so now I want to ask you about the McLean County Board. I know, for instance, that District 9 is a very unusual shape. Can you tell us about that?
Well, it's an unusual shape for McLean County. It's not so unusual in the broad context of how it's been done in other states at the local level and at the state level. Mm-hmm. But, I didn't think to look up a Wisconsin map, which might have reinforced the point you and I were just making.
Right.
In McLean County, after the 2010 census, the county board chairman proposed a new map that had at least 2 examples of deliberate gerrymandering. After considerable discussion by county board members, including a fairer alternative proposal put forward by a Republican member of the board, the county board voted to approve the chairman's proposed map. One example, it's on screen now, one example of deliberate gerrymandering involves District 9 and its next door neighbor, District 8, which is to the north. That next door neighbor district has been a very strongly Democratic leaning district for several decades, while by contrast, District 9 has at least leaned Republican for much of that same time. In the map adopted by the county board, several Democratic leaning precincts that had been in District 9 were moved into District 8, further cementing Democratic majority control of District 8, but weakening Democratic strength in District 9.
Right. Okay, let's take a moment and look at the District 9 map. And Kelsey, I'm not sure if you've got the bars at the tools at the bottom or off to the lower right to zoom in. I don't know if those transfer, because we downloaded those. Ah, you do.
Yeah.
Okay, right. So what I wanted to look at was those holes. So we've actually got little squares and little triangles that are holes in this district, and to me that is a disenfranchisement of these residents, and it's very unfair to an elected official to try and serve people who are completely cut out of an otherwise cohesive district. Well, no, this one is not cohesive at all. So let's look at County Board District 3 and find out where those holes go, or what happens. They become islands. That's what happens. Yeah, so there's those. So that, are we on 3 now? Yes, we're on, yes. So now we're on County Board District 3, and we can see that those holes from 9 become little islands of people in a county board district, completely different to what's surrounding them. All right, so George, the next question I have for you is that my understanding is that congressional districts are not allowed to have holes or islands. They have to be contiguous is perhaps the right word.
Yeah, the phrase that has been in use in the law on this subject is that congressional House districts, U.S. House districts, must be compact and contiguous.
Okay.
Now, contiguous means there can't be disconnected portions of a district.
Right.
Decades ago, a lot of U.S. House districts had those kinds of disconnects. Pieces of the district chopped off from the rest of the district. In looking at one of the close-up shots of District 9 and District 3 just now, I don't think I knew, and I thought that I did know this, but I just discovered something new, that there's at least a couple of pieces of District 9 that are freestanding, plunked down in the middle of District 3. It's not a great number. It doesn't affect a great number of people, but it's the principle of the thing.
Right.
House districts, U.S. House districts, are supposed to be compact and contiguous. And since the Supreme Court, a number of decades ago, went after legislative malapportionment, that is, drawing district boundaries inappropriately, the number of such instances has decreased notably. To say that those have been eliminated completely is an overstatement. They're supposed to be compact and contiguous.
Right.
Once the districts are approved, and they are usually drawn, as we've been suggesting, by state legislatures or a commission appointed by a state legislature that usually has a partisan tilt one way or the other. Once the districts are in place, it takes litigation in court to undo it. And sometimes people are willing or more than willing to take that on, and sometimes they're not. So that a lot of districts get through. Fewer U.S. House districts are malapportioned in 2020. Or let me say in the 21st century, than was the case a century ago.
Right, right. I find it interesting that the Supreme Court ruled that they weren't going to get involved in state legislative districts, but they felt it fair, however many years ago, to go ahead and rule on congressional districts.
Yeah.
Now there are also gerrymandering examples in Normal in your district?
Well, there was some gerrymandering that involved my district. I mentioned there were 2 examples of gerrymandering. This is the other one.
Okay.
It involved the 3 county board districts that are located in the town of Normal, including the district that I currently serve, District 6. The adopted map that had been proposed by the board chairman packed a lot of the town's Democrats into District 6 in a way that made Districts 4 and 5, the other 2 districts in the town of Normal, at least competitive, if not leaning Republican.
Right.
And by the way, let me mention the alternative plan that I mentioned earlier. The alternative plan that the board chose not to adopt would have made all 3 districts in Normal highly competitive, including District 6. And I should note that the Republican board member who proposed that alternative serves one of the 2 districts that would have been made more competitive. In other words, it wasn't really in his electoral self-interest. So he was proposing fair map. The 2 proposals were debated, and the county board decided to adopt the one that the chairman had put forward, practicing the fine art of what I like to label as Democrats packing. Because then Republicans had a better chance in the other 2 districts. I'll note also that in the 2018 election, a Democrat was elected in both District 4 and District 5. So you never quite know how drawing districts will work, because it still depends on the voters and how we decide to settle things.
That's right. If you have a candidate who's willing to get out there and talk to the voters and can connect with voters on a personal level and ensure the voters that you're there to serve them and to listen to them, then, you know, it doesn't always matter how the maps are drawn. But I'm at least pleased to see that there are lines that seem to keep neighborhoods together, because that's kind of my biggest problem with our county board District 9 and 3, is that it just, you know, carves out neighborhoods, and I don't appreciate that disenfranchisement. Now, I thought I saw a question pop up. Kelsey, did we have a question?
Yes, we actually have a couple of questions.
Okay.
So the first, if gerrymandering is being done by the party in charge, how do we overcome this corrupt tendency in order to pass legislation that would ban gerrymandering? And how do we get support for such legislation if both parties do in fact benefit from it today?
Right. So I was definitely going to get to talking about fair maps. There has been a fair maps amendment proposed in the state of Illinois, and I was looking at the proposal, and it's very much a bipartisan proposal. I'm not sure why it didn't make it onto the 2020 ballot, because it looked like it had enough bipartisan support. And I doubt that the Illinois fair maps, I don't know for sure if it would affect the county board maps. It's more specifically for the General Assembly, for the state legislature, for the House of Representatives and the Senate districts. And that is something that I definitely support, and I will reiterate that a little bit later. And what other questions did we have, Kelsey?
Yeah, there was a question from David. Can suits be filed against these gerrymandered districts? And if so, who bears the cost of such litigation?
Oh, I don't know, George, that's one for you.
Thank you very much, Carla. I appreciate that. Lawsuits can be filed, but the costs would be borne by the plaintiffs.
Right.
Which is very often a disqualifier right off the top. Carla,
Sure.
I'd like to go back to something you were saying in response to the question about how do we overcome the corrupt tendency in order to pass legislation that would ban gerrymandering. I don't know that you could pass legislation. And the Fair Maps Amendment was an effort to amend the state constitution,
right,
which is even a higher barrier to clear than legislation. But a state also could do what Iowa and Washington state, and there's a third one that I never can remember, that have created nonpartisan or at least bipartisan redistricting commissions.
Right.
And
you know, we do, sorry, I'm just going to interrupt you just for a second, George. We do have a map that my intern Jenny provided for us. Kelsey, that's the map of the United States that has the green highlighted states. If you're able to find that, and George, I'll let you keep talking, and we'll see if little technical challenge for Kelsey to scroll through and find that.
Well, she doesn't have to listen to what I'm saying. She should focus, and I'm sure she will.
There we go. There it is,
here we
George.
Go. Okay, the number now is 16 states. All right.
Yeah.
And Washington is there, and well, Missouri is there, but not Iowa. Iowa must have changed its tune. The independent commission doesn't have the absolute last word on the congressional or state legislative redistricting.
Okay.
But they take the initial steps, and then I believe the legislatures, if the legislatures are going to shoot down their proposals, it takes an extraordinary majority to do so. So that the barrier is pretty high to disapprove an independent commission's recommendations. And in those states, at least some of the states, I know this is the case in Washington, there is a requirement in the law creating the redistricting commission that all districts must be no more lopsided than 60-40. They have to
Okay.
be, the minority has to be at least 40%.
You mean
And-
you mean the minority of the usual Democratic or usual Republican voters?
Yeah, in any one district, it can't be any more lopsided either way than
Okay.
60-40.
Right,
And
right.
let me make a point on this too,
Mhm.
because one of the things we've seen in Congress, this is not directly related to redistricting, but I think there may be a connection. There is some thought that one of the reasons we are in a period of party dysfunction is that legislators in Congress, in the US House, and this could also be true in the state houses across the country, many of those legislators are elected from districts which are 70-30, 80-20, and for a legislator to be reelected, he or she does not have to pay any attention to the minority.
Right.
And if you've got a lot of districts 80-20 Republican and a lot of other districts 80-20 Democrat, when they arrive in the state or national capital, what's the incentive to talk to the other side?
Mm-hmm.
Now, I'm not suggesting that that is an explanation for all the stuff going on, but I have seen some research and some literature in the political science discipline that suggests this may be a contributing factor.
Right.
If states have redistricting commissions or laws that prohibit any more lopsidedness than 60-40, that might help to contribute to a somewhat more cordial atmosphere where you have to pay some attention to the other party's voters who are in your district so that you cannot just blithely ignore them.
Right.
Maybe that has some validity, maybe not. I think it does.
Okay. Yeah, no, that makes a lot of sense. All right, I'm actually gonna ask Kelsey to show us since we were talking about congressional districts a little bit ago, we've got two maps that show us what Illinois looked like, the congressional districts looked like after the 2000 census, and then a second one that shows us what it looked like after the 2010 census. So this one that we're seeing now, this map was in effect from 2003 to 2013. So I guess, I guess it takes about 3 years to redraw the maps and solidify them.
I think there may have been a challenge to at least one of the districts that took a little more time. I'm not 100% sure of that.
No, you are correct. There was, because that information was helpfully provided to me by my intern. So you can see how District 18 is that light blue, and then 17 is that sort of dark purple, and it just, it carves around and goes underneath 18 and then juts into 19 and kind of and kind of surrounds a square within 19. I mean, that's some very crafty gerrymandering. Okay,
can we call it creative?
Creative. Okay,
Yeah.
creative.
It's
very creative.
You notice that the 11th district also has,
yes,
to a lesser extent, some of the same kind of pattern. But those are the only two, maybe 16 as it juts over to District 8 up near Lake Michigan. But 11 and 17 were the two that I think were most clearly gerrymandered for partisan advantage.
Right. Okay, let's take a look at what we have right now.
Yeah.
And we'll get to the census in a little bit, but it is important just to, give a little plug for the census that it's very important to be counted, because that's one of the criteria for drawing these congressional districts, because they have to have fairly equal population, which is why our District 15 covers so much land mass. That district is largely rural. And then when you get into the Chicagoland area, because it's so densely populated, we have many more congressional districts within the city of Chicago and suburban Chicago because of population. Now, Kelsey, also in this document, there's a district that looks like a horseshoe. Can we see that?
Yep, it is.
Right, there we go. So the story about this district is that this one is actually drawn to make sure that Hispanic or Latinx voters are represented by have a representative to serve their interests. So my understanding of this particular district is that these areas are populated by Latinx people, and but they call this the Horseshoe District. And it's contiguous. It kind of looks like there's a hole in one spot there, but it's not. It's not exactly. It kind of goes around. It goes around a neighborhood, but the lines are actually. Oh, you can enlarge it. Awesome. Yeah. The lines are contiguous.
Is that compact and contiguous? I would argue it's not.
No. I mean, there's no islands. There's no islands, but
But you got a heck of a peninsula right in the middle of it.
Right.
However, that it is compact. It doesn't have broken off pieces.
Right. It has no islands
Yeah.
and no actual holes
That's
in
right.
the middle of it,
That's
like our county board District 9 does in McLean County.
Yeah.
All right. So I'm going to go ahead and talk a little bit about my legislative district, and I'm going to share my screen now with my map. Oh dear, I don't see it. Here we go. Move that up. Okay, let's try again. This is why I asked Kelsey to do the tech, because she's like,
you're getting your map up.
There we go. Okay, now I've got it. Okay.
And if Live.
Yes.
Just to take a look at the difference between Ray LaHood and Darren LaHood. Their districts are very different. So
okay. Yep. We will do that. Okay. So this is the shape of my district. This is District 88. And you can see that District 88 and 105 split Bloomington and Normal in half. And honestly, as a citizen of Bloomington Normal, I don't like the idea that we are split in half, because people here have a Bloomington address, but also people over here have a Bloomington address. People in here go to District 87, but once you get outside of I-55 and on the other side of I-74, everybody else is in Unit 5. So now Unit 5 has, 2 different state representatives, 2 different state senators paying attention to their school districts and trying to engage with residents, and it just makes it difficult. So 105. Oh, right. I was just thinking what you said, Kelsey. That was Ray LaHood. That's back to the congressional district. So we'll have to. We would have to show We would have to show the, or Darren LaHood.
Yeah.
We would have to show the congressional districts again to talk about that. Here, I'm gonna zoom out. Okay, so again, I know that the districts have to reflect a certain population number of people, and I don't think I really mind at all that Champaign has one representative, and largely the city of Peoria has one representative, because that's a cohesive community of people, and that's kind of my personal opinion about that. But I do have a problem with the way this looks here, where my District 88 comes into Tazewell County, and it includes the community of Morton, it includes the community of Washington. But if you drive through this area, this area is separated from Peoria by a river, and all the rest of this area, and also the county seat of Tazewell County, is served by a different state representative. And that's District 93. So they've got District 93 going from this largely rural area, and then they come in here and they grab the more populated areas of Pekin and East Peoria. And I would like to see some changes at some point, and perhaps fair maps or independent commissions could take into account the communities and the neighborhoods and the individual people. All right, well, Kelsey, let's go ahead and if you can find that the current Illinois congressional map, we can go back and take a look at that.
Carla, I was hoping you were going to do that, because I wanted to make a comment or two about that.
Sure.
Yeah.
Okay, so 18 is served by Darren LaHood. 13 is currently served by Rodney Davis. And you can see in our community, and again, our community of Bloomington Normal is chopped up by and served by two different members of Congress in Washington. And you can see Bloomington, and you can see how there's this little thin part that juts up into Bloomington and actually into Normal. And I hope that we'll see Betsy Dirksen Londrigan serving us after the November election. And Kelsey, what was the question again, please?
Sorry, missed the unmute button there. It was just a comment. It's true. Just look at the difference between Ray LaHood and Darren LaHood. Their district is very different. And somebody who lives in Bloomington proper, I go to Unit 5 schools. My kids go to Unit 5 schools. I am in the 18th congressional district, and block over is the 13th congressional district.
Right.
It's very, very. I'm in this little circle donut here. Difficult to know, especially having recently moved to town here. It was very difficult to know who my representative was.
Right.
Without having to look it up, just because the addresses there were so, on the line.
Right. All right. Before we start talking about the census, are there any more questions or comments?
There was one question about how can we ensure that our police are held accountable. I don't know if you want to hold that until the end, because it's a little bit off topic from what we were talking about, unless you're going to kind of weave it in.
I hadn't planned to weave it in, although it might be. I don't have the census page in front of me just yet, but as far as holding police accountable, I'm happy to answer that and to say that that I certainly support restructuring and reimagining our police, and I hope that I can be elected and I can be a voice for our community in Springfield. I already support criminal justice reform. I already support ending cash bail. Um, on the local level, it's very important to have a city council that is willing to listen to the concerns of the residents and take the concerns seriously. And that's really the best place to start changing the structure of your local police department, is with your city council. And if you have any concerns about how the sheriff operates, that is under the county board. So we do have people running for county board on the November ballot who support restructuring, defunding, even the police. And city council, you need to, if you want to run for city council, now's the time to look into that and to get your ballot petition ready, get ready to run. And you submit your ballot petition in the fall so that you can be on the ballot in the municipal elections in April. So that's my answer about the police at this time. And then I wanted to talk about the census because
Carla,
yes.
excuse me, before we go ahead with that, I
Mhm.
want to clarify something that you referred to just now.
Mhm.
You referred to the sheriff and
Mm.
operations of the sheriff's department and that being under the county board. As a technical legal matter,
Mhm.
the sheriff has, I'm going to say something here that is true of the sheriff and of all other elected countywide officials.
Okay.
They are, under state law, they are responsible almost exclusively for the internal operations of their offices. The city council in Bloomington or Normal or any other municipality, home rule municipality that you want to mention, the city council has a lot to do with the operations of the police department.
Right.
The sheriff's department is in a different category because the sheriff is an elected countywide official.
Mhm.
So the sheriff, like the clerk of the circuit court, like the county clerk, the coroner, the state's attorney, each of those office holders has a much greater degree of control over internal operations of their offices, their respective offices, than is sometimes understood.
Right.
The county board has leverage in terms of the budget,
Mhm.
but that is kind of a clumsy instrument, because if the budget is used to punish some elected office holder who doesn't get along with the county board, that's taking away from the ability of that office, whoever occupies it, to deliver public services that the public expects to have delivered.
Right.
The other source of leverage is persuasion.
Mhm.
Beyond that, though, the law really favors the office holder. The default setting, if you will, is that the office holder has a lot of control, and that is not always clearly understood. And I would hope that that it will be better understood.
Okay. Well, thank you so much for that clarification. There's a lot of emotion behind um, behind these efforts and these questions about restructuring our police and taking funds and putting them into other areas and building up other support areas so that the police don't have to respond to mental health calls and so on. But I will just reiterate that city council is definitely the place to look at restructuring the police and changing the funding for the police. Any additional comments, Kelsey, after George's explanation for us?
Yes, there was a follow-up. I think the first question, I think you answered, George. The first question was, aren't there state laws which protect sheriffs from local accountability, which I think you really articulated well. And then a kind of a follow-up, what would need to change at the state level to give more local control?
There would need to be legislation enacted by the Illinois General Assembly and signed into law by the governor that would shift some degree of control more to the local level. But how that would be done, off the top of my head, I'm not in a position to suggest specific courses of action. But the General Assembly is in charge of non-home rule counties. Out of Illinois' 102 counties, there's only one that is a home rule county. The main criterion for being a home rule county is a minimum county population of 1 million. So all one of it, Cook, is a home rule county. The other 101 of us can do what the General Assembly says we can do. We do what the General Assembly tells us we must do.
Oh.
And we don't do what the General Assembly doesn't authorize us to do.
Right.
And
right.
usually in many states, and I think Illinois is one of them, unless the General Assembly has specifically authorized a non-home rule county to engage in some area or line of activity, the county doesn't have the authority to do it. So it starts at the state level. The question, the second question asked, the follow-up, is the right question. So what would need to change at the state level to give more local control? The change has to start there.
All right. All right. Well,
I hope that's the beginning of an answer.
Well, I really appreciate whoever decided to ask about the police when we're talking about gerrymandering, because I learned something, and I'm really glad to know that if I am elected, that I could definitely have a voice in Springfield for changing some things that could help a lot of people.
And at the local level too.
Mm-hmm.
If you can get a majority for it, which
yeah, well, you know,
first you have to be there.
First I have to be there, and then I have to work with other legislators and people who are interested in writing the legislation. A lot of the legislation that is written comes from community organizations.
Mm-hmm.
And I know this because I have been part of the coalition to end cash bail, and I know that the legislation started from a community organization, and then you get people to sponsor it, and then you work on the language, and then it goes to committee, and people argue about the language. And work it out until it's a bill that people are ready to put on the floor and vote for. All right. I do want to talk about the census before we finish tonight. Now, I understand that both state and federal legislative districts are drawn after each census. So, who draws those lines right now? And George, what do you think might happen in Illinois? And has Illinois made some unusual adjustments in the past? Now, we did just look at the maps, so hopefully having seen those maps will refresh your memory about some decisions that have been made.
Well, I was going to take the last question first, just because it's
Sure.
probably the easiest to answer. I don't know how you want to define unusual. Some of the, even in the absence of egregious gerrymandering, you have some really interesting looking lines.
Mm-hmm.
Go back to District 9 in the county board in McLean County. There was one point where Kelsey panned back on District 9, and it struck me all of a sudden that the western part of that district reminds me at least of the Starship Enterprise. It is set up in such a way that
It is.
it's got these things up here that well, I go back to the earliest versions of the Starship Enterprise.
I love
Anyway,
it. George Gordon's a Trekkie.
yeah,
That's
well,
awesome.
yeah, I wouldn't go quite that far, but I'll accept that. I'll accept that as a compliment, and I appreciate
Yes, please do
it.
so.
State legislative districts obviously have some fairly interesting histories too, if you look at them. The first question is an important one to begin with seriously now. Who draws those lines right now?
Yeah.
As a technical matter, the legislature does. It has been a common practice in Illinois, and it may be again after the 2020 census, for the legislature to have the Republican leaders in the House and Senate, the Democratic leaders in the House and Senate, each appoint 2 members of a 9-member commission. You've got 2 sets of leadership, 2 members each. That adds up to 8. Then each party, as they did in 2000, after the 2000 census and after 2010, each party put a name into a hat. As a matter of fact, this goes back into the 1980s, to my knowledge. It may even go back further. A name goes into the hat, and somebody trusted by both sides, I assume there's at least one person in Springfield that fits that description, reaches a hand into the hat and pulls out a name. And as a practical matter, after an awful lot of conversation and after an awful lot of discussion and arguing and counter-arguing and counter-arguing, as a practical matter, in my experience, looking at this at least, the party of the person whose name is pulled out of the hat is going to draw the districts. It is up to the legislature to accept that legislative commission recommendation. This isn't the kind of independent, nonpartisan redistricting commission that was sketched out earlier on the map with 16 states. Excuse me. This is a commission that is distinctly bipartisan, not nonpartisan.
Right.
And depending how those 9 people get along, there may be some of the sharp edges of partisan disagreement that might be smoothed off. But it's a very complicated process, as you can see from looking at the results. I can picture something that I just saw tonight again for it's the first time in a long time. The 17th congressional district in the first decade of the 21st century, not this one, not this decade, but the first decade. And that district that, if you remember, curled around,
yes,
and then went under the 18th district and curled up. That looked a lot like the original. There you go.
Yep.
If I can go off on just a little bit of a side trip, not much of one. You know where the term gerrymander came from?
You've caught me off guard. I did know that, but
excuse me, I'm not
I have
asking.
heard it.
I'm
Yeah,
not
go right
asking,
ahead.
I'm not asking you. I'm asking those who are listening. Back in the 1790s, a Massachusetts governor whose last name was spelled Gerry, he actually pronounced it Gary, Elbridge Gerry. His party, and parties weren't very well developed then, but his party put together a legislative map for the Massachusetts state legislature that had and if you look at the 17th district, it looks a lot like the original gerrymander. It looked a little bit, it didn't go down as far as the 17th district, but if you start just sort of the southwest corner of the 18th and then go up the 17th and then come across into the 14th, somebody took a look at that district and said, that looks like a salamander. And somebody came up with the label, that is Gary's, we pronounce it Jerry's salamander.
Right.
So the verb gerrymander, or the noun gerrymander, was a contraction of Jerry's salamander.
Right.
And when I saw that district back in the 2010s, the 17th district, the first decade of this century, I took one look at that and said, Elbridge Gerry must really be proud of us, because that looks like very close to, it looks very close to the salamander that was on the
Yeah.
Massachusetts map for the 1790 election,
Oh my goodness.
after the 1790 census. It's just remarkable how, the more things change, the more they stay the same. Back to the question. It is a bipartisan redistricting commission. And we've had it happen that a Republican majority partisan redistricting commission made its recommendations and the Democratic majority General Assembly accepted it.
Mm-hmm.
Because the commission has a lot of status in the eyes of the legislators. This is the way the game is played, and that's so we'll try to minimize the damage, but we can't do much about it because the commission takes the lead.
Right.
So that's who does the districts. So what I might think happens in Illinois is going to depend in part on how that commission is constituted, and if it the last two times it's been a Democratic majority by the luck of the draw. Good luck for the Democrats, bad luck for the Republicans.
Mm-hmm.
And there have been some districts drawn that clearly favor the Democrats. One of the things that is very much at issue in this census and the subsequent redistricting is whether Illinois' population gain in this last decade will be too slow to keep pace with the national average. Because if it is too slow, we're going to lose a House seat.
So you're saying it's about keeping pace. I thought it was just about sheer numbers of people, but
the U.S. House, as you well know, has a fixed number of members, 435. So that if there are some states that gain population more rapidly than others, they're going to be entitled, because it's proportionate to population in the U.S. House, they're going to be entitled to gain a seat. And it's a fixed total of seats. So that if, for example, and I've seen this example cited as a real probability, Texas right now has 36 House seats. I've seen an estimate, maybe it's only a guesstimate, but it's an estimate, that Texas may gain 1 or 2 House seats. Okay, Arizona may gain 1. Florida may gain 1. In recent decades, California has skyrocketed. California had 38 House seats in 1960. Now they have 53. They gained 15 seats in half a century. California's population gains may actually be leveling off. But whatever we find with a state gaining population and therefore entitled to more House seats, those House seats have to come from somewhere else.
Right.
They have to come from some other state losing.
Yeah.
And I've seen an estimate, and I know people who have studied this much more than I, that Illinois is almost certain to lose 1 House seat, maybe 2.
Wow.
Return now to the question of what I think might happen. Because if we're going to lose House seats, that means that unless an incumbent representative retires, 2 representatives may get thrown together in a Republican or Democratic primary in 2022. Because somebody's district was combined into somebody else's.
Yeah.
It's that kind of fine detail that keeps some people up at night, particularly politicians who may be afraid of losing their House seat.
Right.
And because of the shape of the 13th and 18th districts, particularly involving how McLean County and Bloomington Normal are divided, there's some speculation that 13 and 18 might be combined.
Wow.
With parts of each district broken off and going elsewhere. But then you would have the prospect, if nothing changes in terms of personnel, you might have the prospect of Rodney Davis and Darren LaHood squaring off in a Republican primary in 2022.
Or Betsy Dirksen Londrigan. And
that is very true. I was
and Darren LaHood.
I was using Davis as the
the incumbent.
But let me throw you a curve. the Democrats would have an easier time combining the 13th and 18th if Lonergan doesn't win. They don't want to lose. They don't want to have her go up against LaHood in a partisan face-off, because they'd have to go against each other in a primary. It couldn't be the general election.
Oh, really?
Yeah.
Even, okay.
I think that's right. Maybe not. I have to think about that a second.
Right.
Anyway,
yeah.
The point being,
everybody needs to be counted. Everybody needs to be counted.
Absolutely. That doesn't.
So that we don't. Yeah.
Nothing I've said changes that. It is
yeah.
terribly important to fill out the census forms,
right.
so that the most accurate numbers possible can be put into use to make the determinations for fair representation or even unfair representation. And
right.
I'll get away from the personalities now. It is
yeah.
very important that the census be as accurate as possible. And there are some indications that we're moving in that direction, but we've still got a long way to go.
Right. Okay. I'm going to ask Kelsey to share the why it is important to participate in the census, because my intern Jenny very helpfully highlighted some important points for us, that the federal government uses census numbers to allocate more than $675 billion in federal funds annually for community programs and services. And so many things depend on this, such as Head Start, Medicare, the SNAP program, Pell Grants for college. And then when we go further down, state, local, and tribal governments use census information for planning and allocating funds. So we get those funds from the federal government depending on how many people we count in our census. If, let's say there's 10,000 people. It's probably low for Illinois, but let's say there's 10,000 people who couldn't be bothered to fill out the census, or they're afraid to fill out the census. Then we don't get that federal funding. So then the state and local and tribal governments, when they're allocating those funds from the federal government, there's more people who need that funding than have been counted. So that's just like the bottom line of why it's important to be counted in the census. And also further down, we've got businesses use the numbers to locate and identify potential markets, to locate factories, shopping centers, movie theaters, things that lead to new jobs. 911 emergency systems are based on maps developed for the last census. So, if people in our rural areas are not accurately counted, then they might not have the 911 emergency systems services that they need. And then, of course, we get to that the census results are used to help redraw congressional, state, and local district boundaries. So very important to be counted. And I do want to point out that by law, the Census Bureau cannot share census answers with other government agencies, including welfare agencies, immigration, the police, the FBI, or the IRS, the Internal Revenue Services, courts, or the military. So your privacy is guaranteed by law. So if there happens to be anybody out there who was concerned about filling out the census, please don't worry about your privacy. Trust that the census takers and the data collected by the census will be kept private and used appropriately. All right, Are there any more questions about anything?
Thanks for checking in, Carla. There are currently no additional questions. This has been great conversation. There was lots of great engagement here on the Facebook Live. So thank you both for spending evenings giving us kind of the down and dirty version of gerrymandering and why the census is important. We definitely learned a few things as well. So thank you very much.
Yeah. All right. Well, thank you again, Kelsey, for hosting, and thank you, George, for sharing your wisdom. And as always, every time I do one of these town halls, I learn some things. I learned several things tonight, and I look forward to using that information wisely. And I'll say good night. And thank you, George.
Thank you, and good luck.
Thanks.